Rewritten! Epilogue! The law had always been something that confused the lines between gems and humans. For instance, if damage was caused by a gem to human property, the issue couldn't just be solved by one of the judgment systems. They had to get the gem to be judged in Homeworld's way, but to be able to conform to the human's way too, so it was fair. If any issues came up, the two systems would have to agree on how to deal with the situation, which was harder than just deciding within themselves. Stephen had worked for a long time to gradually transition Homeworld into something like a democracy, making sure to make the change not too jarring since they were living under a dictatorship before, and luckily, now each quarrel didn't make a new headline. But the law didn't seem to know what to do about what Stephen had done. He had caused a lot of damage to Beach City, most of it human property, but it wasn't because of a malicious intent, it was because of corruption, so Stephen hadn't been aware enough to stop himself whenever it was happening. It was like pleading insanity, but he'd been taken out of the insanity in a magic way that was far faster than any normal human could, so did it still count? He hadn't been aware enough to do it on purpose. Stephen barely remembered anything from whenever he was corrupted. Most of it was just horrible emotions, too intense to describe, and an endless swarm of butterflies. Still, it had happened, and workers needed to be paid to fix it. Even though Stephen was a part of Homeworld's government, that didn't mean that he got off free with the humans. The Diamonds would probably forgive him if he turned the entire palace to dust, but that was just not excusable for any sensible human judges. And even though Stephen technically owned the Earth through an authority far greater than any humans and could do whatever he wanted, Stephen had been trying to keep things peaceful and has been pretending to be a normal, law-abiding citizen, even though he'd be perfectly capable of taking over the world if he felt like it. The humans probably only let him get this far because they knew all about that by now. Even though the human world usually tried to keep their nose out of the Gem one, this was a big enough mistake to cause several questions to rise up and argue between them, and if Stephen was going to be a normal citizen, he had to follow the rules. The only reason this hadn't come up the moment that he was back to a human-like form was because they weren't ready to risk more damage being dealt to Beach City due to his second takeover of the corruption. But when they were finally confronted about it, as Stephen had been expecting, the conclusion was much easier reached than he thought that it would be. His dad was already a billionaire from that commercial, and all that money was just lying in the bank because of his hoarding habits keeping him from spending it all once again. So his dad gladly paid out a huge chunk of it to the repairs, enough to make everybody happy. Money apparently fixed everything. Stephen had, at first, been horrified that his dad was draining pretty much every bit of those savings for him. He had already spent a lot on the hospital bills and didn't want to continue leeching off of his own father. But his dad had insisted that all of this was partway his own fault and that he was perfectly happy doing this. "It's not like I'm using the money for anything else," his dad had told him, "and I can't think of any better way to use it." Still, how easily Stephen had gotten off his punishment really messed with him, and he already had a lot of other things messing with him, so this was just another burning coal in the pile that he was treading over. He didn't feel like he had done enough to fix this. He felt like everyone was just trying to forget what he had done to them instead of punishing him for it. He wanted to be punished. He wanted some sort of justice to come down on him for his actions so he could learn his lesson. But, of course, nobody would do that to him. Humans were too afraid of Homeworld deciding to give up all this equal rights charade and do whatever they did to every other life-giving planet out there. And his family still seemed to think that he was an angel, despite everything. He really had no idea why they didn't want to slap him for what he did, at the very least. The idea of them still liking him and sticking around was incomprehensible. He must have manipulated them all somehow. He was evil, rotten to the core. They were going to find him out. They were going to hate him. You've tricked them all. You're just a parasite. You're using them. The guilt was unbearable. And if they weren't going to do something about it, he was. "Stephen?" He blinked and realized that he was staring at his plate of untouched breakfast, as if the food itself had hypnotized him. He looked up to see his dad sitting with him on his bed. Everyone else was in his room, and even though it was a reasonably sized space, it made it feel cramped. He didn't like small spaces, but he liked his family, but he didn't like how they were all insisting on staying within 10 feet of him every second of every day. It felt like they thought that if someone wasn't watching him, he'd blow up into another crazed monster. Maybe he would. He saw them all watching him while pretending to not be, their eyes flicking away only whenever his challenged theirs, tracking his every movement with tensed figures. It was too difficult to walk without help in his state. So far, no progress had been made on the reduction of his corruption scars, and they were as painful as ever, refusing to make any task easy for him. So, most mornings had been spent like this, with breakfast being eaten in bed with his cautious guardians sitting like watchdogs around him, waiting for something that he wished they didn't feel the need to wait for. Is something on your mind? His dad asked him whenever he didn't respond. He'd been keeping such a close tab on him, hardly leaving his side, caring for him like he was a baby again. Some itchy part of Stephen hated that, not only because he wanted to be treated like an adult, but because he didn't like to be such a burden on his father. He shouldn't have to do that for him. He shouldn't have to take care of him, just as he shouldn't have to pay off all the damage that he'd done. Stephen wanted to suffer this by himself. Suffer. I want to go outside, he said stiffly, his sentence broken up as it struggled to get out. He'd been feeling like this all day, jumbled up and confused, like somebody had held him by his feet and shaken him until his brains fell out. He was pretty sure that it was from whenever he'd fought back against his gem yesterday. It was still prowling in the back of his head, and the effort that he put forwards to compromising had sucked all the life out of him. Pearl quickly put on one of her sweet smiles and said, "Oh, of course, Stephen, I'm sure some fresh air could do you some good." No, she didn't get it. No, he shook his head. I want to go help with the fixing, construction, now. He knew he sounded disoriented, but he felt too disoriented to reorient at all. He just wanted to go do something. The urge was eating away at him. Nobody moved, so he pushed his full plate to the side and tried to take the covers off of him with his awkwardly clawed paws. He was dragging his splotched legs over to the side of the bed whenever his dad reached out and caught him, holding him back. Wait, what are you talking about?" he asked. "I should help, right? I destroyed it. I've got diamond strength. I should be the one to help repair it," Stephen explained, wanting to pull away but not wanting to cut his dad on accident with the spines cresting his shoulder and back. "Wait, hold on, Stewball," his dad warned. "I don't think that's a good idea. You're really weak right now." Amethyst agreed with, "Yeah, dude, you don't gotta go rushing off to help people yet. You've done enough." The "you've done enough" part of that could be interpreted in two different ways, and he didn't know which one she meant. She might mean that he'd helped enough for now, which was a lie, or she might mean that he'd destroyed enough and should stop before he does something worse. When he continued to try and get out of bed, Pearl came forward and pointed out, "Wait, but you can't go into the town, remember?" Stephen remembered one of the restrictions that had been set on him just from a vote by the Beach City residents. He wasn't allowed to be anywhere that wasn't his house, the therapist's office, or along the beach, both for his safety, since he could very well strain himself enough to get wounded, and for the safety of the other citizens. His pink outbursts could cause serious casualties if a passerby got caught in one. The rule made sense, but he didn't like it anyway. It made him feel like they were outcasting him. He felt bad for being mad at the rule, though, because he very clearly deserved it, and it was just for making everyone safer. "Yeah, but," he began, trying to find a loophole. "Maybe I'd be allowed if I was helping." Garnet adjusted her reflective visor, peeking into the future, and said, "That's unlikely. I don't see anything good coming out of your plan. I'm sorry, Stephen." "Besides, you can't possibly think you can travel that far," his dad continued. "I know those scars hurt a lot more than you're letting on. You might injure yourself." He was right about the pain. Stephen wished that he wasn't. This isn't about me. This is about helping the reconstruction," he snapped. "I don't care if I break all the bones in my body. I'm gonna help." Pearl tried for distraction. "Oh, okay. Clearly you're restless, but maybe we can find some other activity for you to do." "No!" he shouted, a sudden surge of anger leaping out of him. "I'm going to help! You can't stop me!" Even though they tried not to show it, he could see the fear that shifted their stance. He could feel that he was glowing pink again, but this time his gem wasn't working against him to fight something that he was afraid of. It was working with him, aiding him with the power that he needed to enforce what he wanted to do today. He knew that any glowing was bad glowing. He wasn't supposed to glow. He was supposed to be getting better. He just fixed this yesterday. He tried to calm down, but a viper inside of him refused to sheathe its fangs. He would calm down if he was helping. That was the only thing that would make him happy. That's how it always was before. Wait, Stephen, no need to get all riled up," Amethyst said uneasily. "Maybe you're just tired. Did you—" He knew what she wanted to ask. He growled in exasperation. "Yes, I took my medicine. This isn't a dumb mood swing. This is me being responsible for my actions like a good person." His clawed toes touched the rug as he tried to escape the bed. "I can't just sit here and do nothing. I have to fix it. I need to!" He had lurched out of bed to try and get up onto his own 2 feet, his claws gripping the desk next to his bed. That was a big mistake. The legs underneath him were suddenly shot with tight cords of pain that lashed up and down his body, making him yelp and crumble down against the drawer heavily, his talons scoring deep gashes into the wood. Stephen! Everyone yelled all at once, leaping forwards to grab him. Garnet had been the first to react, probably having predicted this, managing to catch him and slow his fall until he slumped down onto the floor, overtaken by the fire that had sent its sparks through every joint and muscle and bone. The big magenta permafusion was holding him down to keep him from getting up, saying, "Careful, try not to move." He tried and failed to push up against her, whimpering in pain. "Stephen, just slow down and think for a moment," Garnet told him. "You can't go. There's no way you'd make it. It's dangerous." Why were they so insistent on stopping him from doing this? Didn't they understand that he needed to go? He needed to help, to somehow start scooping some of the guilt out of him, to at least get a little bit of the crushing weight off of his heart. Stephen couldn't form a sentence. He was just trying not to scream as his nerves zapped their protest through him, forcing him to give up his attempts to push himself back to his feet again. He was limp and twitching, on his side, willing it to go away, unable to fight back against Garnet's help no matter how much he wanted to. "You don't need to do anything, Stewall," his dad was saying, kneeling next to his head with a hand supporting his shoulder. "It's all taken care of, remember? You healed everyone, and I paid off the construction already. The workers are doing the same job they would have already been doing." They carefully sat him up against the side of his drawer once it was okay, trying to keep him as still as possible. The dragging shame that he felt was worse than any soreness that could claw into his muscles. He stared blearily up at his dad and groaned, But it's not fair to you. You shouldn't have to do all that for me. None of you should have to stay with me at all. I was the one that caused this. I should be the one to pay for it." He closed his eyes and leaned his throbbing head back against the drawers. His dad's expression was disbelieving, like Stephen was speaking a different language. "Stephen, you're my son. I don't mind doing all this, really." He sighed, scratching the back of his neck and meeting Stephen's gaze of sincerity. "Look, I was a bad father," he admitted. "I never looked out for you. I just left you to the world. I thought I was being freeing, like I was just letting you have a longer leash than I did, but instead I let go of it entirely and watched you get lost. I should have been there for you instead of expecting for you to figure it out yourself. I'm sorry that I was so careless before. I love you, Shoeball, and I'm never going to let anything happen to you ever again, all right?" He held the side of his son's face, ignoring the tusks and scales that had overtaken more than half of it. "You fixed other people's mistakes your whole life. Just this once, let all of us, pay the price instead of you." Stephen wanted to believe that. Every aching pang that was chipping away at his body was begging for him to give in, get back in bed, and eat something. He wished that he could just move the responsibility onto them and forget about it. The thought of not needing to worry about all this fixing he had to do made him want to collapse in relief. And, in the moment, he was able to agree. Right then, in those few seconds where pain pressured him from every side, he was grateful to let himself forget the idea of helping entirely so he could be lifted back into bed by his family. But the feeling of guilt never went away permanently. It was just stalled until next time. That next time came with a vengeance. Something was itching at him. The urge to do something, anything, was filling up the dark, lonely cave that he was trapped in, the lapping ink creeping up his torso towards his head in a slow march to drown him. This time, it wasn't just the destruction that he'd caused. This time, it was for Jasper. The murder of a human wouldn't have been taken as lightly as this. He would have been thrown in jail for possibly the rest of his life, even having the threat of execution over his head depending on which state he was in. But Stephen hadn't killed a human. He had killed a gem. Within the law that the gems and humans had agreed on, if something happens to a human, the humans punish, and vice versa for the gems. And the diamonds had barely batted an eye at his murder confession. They had all done so much more to so many more gems in their time as dictators, and so Stephen didn't receive as much as a timeout. It was just like the Reconstruction issue, but so much worse. He had ended a life, and nobody seemed to care. It was unfair to her, and he had no way of fixing it because he couldn't just wait until paid construction workers reassembled her shards. There was nothing he could ever do to bring her back, no matter what he did. Jasper was dead. Stephen couldn't stand the awful guilt as it rotted in his head, only growing on his brain further and further like a sickness. He needed to do something about it, and he needed to do it now, before it ate him alive.